After a 3-year pause, student loan repayments resumed on Sunday. Borrowers were extended a temporary relief back in 2020 after the onset of the pandemic. 28 million borrowers will now have to pick back up repaying their student loans right where they left off.
According to the U.S. Census Bureau, millions of Americans, more than 150 million, are living paycheck to paycheck, 64 million of whom are not going to be able to afford an abrupt $500 hike in monthly debt payments. A survey by Life in My Finances found that half of borrowers cannot afford repaying their loans, and only 22% plan to resume paying down their student debt. Economic policy analyst and Rising Fridays co-host Jessica Burbank joins us now to weigh in. Welcome, Jessica.
Thanks for having me.
All right. So from a political perspective, this is what we're looking at. We're looking at there are 44 million borrowers altogether. The proportion that we read just above that cannot respond to a $500 emergency are now being asked to add a $400+ expense to their monthly expenses. And on top of all of that, people who have started to try to use the income-based repayment plan today got a notice that there is maintenance on the website and they're not even able to register and take advantage of the relief that comes through the income-based repayment plan. So what does this look like for Joe Biden being the one turning these payments back on going into an election year?
Yeah, I mean, Joe Biden already had the failure of initially trying to rely on the HEROES Act to get this done, which I think many people could have predicted would not be the pathway to get this done. The excuse essentially for using the HEROES Act was, well, the secretary could waive the student loan payments and the student loan debt because it was a time of a national emergency, COVID-19. He could have relied on the Higher Education Act of 1965, which does give the education secretary the right to waive any lien or right of redemption, so student loans. And so that was kind of his first faux pas. And it begs the question, did he ever want to get this done in the first place? If he's relying on legislation that predictably would not be the most concrete legal grounding for this policy. And so that legal case is an interesting one because now they say, okay, well, we're going to pursue the Higher Education Act of 1965, which puts them in the position where they have to meet with a bunch of stakeholders and try and reach some kind of consensus. They usually don't. But this process of meeting with stakeholders and considering comments can take up to several months to a year. They should have postponed student loan repayment because of an emergency until they sorted that out. That would have been the right thing to do because, as you stated, their website isn't even prepared to take on folks trying to use this save option where they have income-based repayment, which is necessary. And so it's a bit of a mess. It's a $1.8 trillion industry. We don't even know how much of that is just accrued interest, not just loans. And so we have all of these servicers that are lobbying Congress to not do much about it because they're making about $1,000 over the lifespan of a loan, which is a lot of money.
I think it's probably no secret that I oppose student debt forgiveness for reasons which I'm sure we'll get into later. But first, I wanted to ask you, Jessica, about, again, the political ramifications of this on Biden, because as you said, he tried to use the HEROES Act ahead of the 2022 midterms. It seemed quite obvious that that wasn't going to withstand a legal challenge. Do you feel like he intentionally sort of led these people on for the purposes of winning that election?
I think it's possible he's made campaign promises to win the election. Anticipating that the Supreme Court would strike it down is a shocking, pathway to take. You very well could be right, but we know that the Supreme Court's, response was to 6 states that sued claiming an injury because of the student loan forgiveness plan. So Biden, I think, definitely should have pursued the kind of policy that he talked about a lot when he was campaigning, which was to open up public school tuition. There were a lot of people that felt, what if someone repaid their student loans? Now, they could have had their student loans forgiven under this plan, but they spent all of that time working. They're never going to get that time back. So is this fair from the perspective of justice? And I think Biden should have also simultaneously pursued, if he was serious about it, a tax credit in the amount that those students paid off their loans in. And so he didn't really consider these long-term policies. So it does kind of seem like he never really saw this coming to fruition. Perhaps he knew that a lot of these states, with the exception of Missouri, were suing on behalf of private companies, on behalf of these student loan servicers. Elena Kagan wrote in the dissent that they had to claim a real injury, not a theoretical injury. And the only reason they were able to actually strike down the student loan repayment plan is that Missouri had its own sort of state-run student loan servicing branch. So it seems that there were so many things that were not considered. This wasn't a holistic policy approach that would hold in the long term. So it does kind of seem like this was something they put together to win votes.
Yeah, I'm inclined to believe that that is the case, not just because of the choice to choose the COVID-era Emergency Hero Act policy as opposed to the Higher Education Act, but also the choice not to simply cancel the debt by executive order and then have people who would oppose that policy try to retroactively put the money back into their bank account, something that we've seen in policy after policy. When the government actually enacts a policy that is very helpful to Americans, like Social Security and Medicaid, it's very difficult to put that genie back in the bottle. And the fact that he means tested the policy is what gave the various 6 states who opposed the policy an opportunity to challenge it and bring these injunctions and stop it in the first place. So it shouldn't be forgotten that he had the opportunity to just cancel it outright, and to the extent that there's concerns about wealthy debtors, which is a bit of a contradiction in and of itself, but wealthy debtors getting a windfall to simply raise taxes on that group. I think it's also worth noting that a lot of debtors are paying more than the cost of their bill because of the nature of these interest rates, which are usurious. There's a lot of conversation about housing interest rates going up and a lot of public concern about what that means for the middle class who have so much of their wealth invested in housing. But there's very little conversation about how student debtors, without having the underlying asset of a house, are being really hurt by these usurious interest rates that have a poorer student paying sometimes 25%, 50%, 100% more for the value of their education than their wealthier peers who are able to pay out of pocket. What do you make, Jessica, of the difference in focus and attention in the public kind of characterization of the deservedness of a middle-class homeowner who might have a home worth $1 million for which they can get tax credits, as opposed to student debtors who often have no assets, can't afford to pay the debts off, and who have really been caught up in an ill-conceived loan system that they were encouraged to take advantage of because they were told that getting an education was the only way to raise their class status in the United States.
It seems that this conversation is plagued with the same crisis of so many political conversations we have in the United States, of this comparison with your neighbors or people living in other neighborhoods, between the working class and the middle class, if you want to draw a line there, a sort of keeping up with the Joneses comparison. Why did they get something that I didn't? We shouldn't think of student loan debt forgiveness as forgiveness. We should think about it as the cancellation of debt that was unjustly issued. Let's think about what a good economy would look like. Would people have access to the education and training they need to be productive members of the economy? Yes, therefore, public education should be free like it was. You could basically pay tuition with a minimum wage job in the 70s. It was a deliberate choice to have these tuition rate hikes. And we saw a 100% increase in the cost of tuition for higher education attendance during the 2008 financial crisis. The economy was not doing so well. People didn't want to enter the job market because of that. And so they sheltered in schools. They decided to go to college instead. It was also a narrative that was told time and again to young students who were in high school that they would need to go to college if they wanted to do well. And the results of this, of wealthy bankers trying to profit off of this increase in college attendance, is that now you have a bunch of working class and middle class people facing a lifetime of debt. Is that a necessary economic structure to have an educated and trained workforce? No. We have the resources necessary to provide education for those who want to go. And that goes for trade school as well, not just colleges and universities. And so when we consider that the quality of education didn't really change, the value of a college degree didn't change too much, why was the tuition raised? This was a scenario where people used essentially their power in the market to raise tuition simply because they could. That is an unjust economic practice, and we need to deal with that before we even consider if it's just to forgive certain people student loan debt. it should be a public good. We should consider education to be a public good. The people who are wealthy in the United States are not in debt. They didn't take out loans to go to college. They paid for it in full. So we really need to reframe the conversation as a whole. It's not a gift to forgive someone's student loan debt. It's a burden that they should have never had to take on in the first place.
I'm definitely sympathetic to the idea that a lot of young people were taken advantage of with these ridiculous interest rates on these loans that frankly would never be offered in the private sector. A lot of these federal loans that were given to students. I have a fundamental problem with the idea that people who didn't go to college, particularly in the working class, should have their taxpayer money going to forgive the debt of the more highly educated, who thus have more of an earning potential. But I wanted to ask about the cost of tuition increases, as you mentioned. How does forgiving the debt not encourage and incentivize these colleges to only raise tuition further? I mean, I think my proposed solution to this would be to force the universities to pay down the debt through their endowments.
Yeah, I would just say that forgiving student loans or canceling student loans, the purpose of that is not to address the high cost of tuition. The policy being pursued would be for economic purposes. It would be a good stimulus for the economy, for people to be able to purchase homes instead of having the majority or just a significant plurality. In Charlotte, where I live now, it's 30%. Of homes being purchased by investors. We should have a working class and a middle class that can become homeowners. And currently they can't because they're paying off their student loans. It would be good for the economy if that capital was freed up and they could spend it into the economy. We need to think about things from that perspective and have different policy proposals for addressing the obscenely high cost of tuition. Reducing the cost of public school tuition and making it free for in-state students would be the approach I would take, because now you have this alternative. You're going to need to reduce your tuition if you want students to go to your school instead of a public school where it's much less expensive. That's the kind of policy solution that provides the economic incentives necessary for private schools to reduce the cost of tuition. I think tuition's too high. I think you're right that these schools have ridiculous endowments where they're making so much money off of investments and they don't have to pay taxes on them. We really need to think critically about new policies to address that, especially in private schools and private universities. I think when we think about interest rates as well, it's an interesting time to consider student loan debt forgiveness, because the explicit purpose of the federal government and Federal Reserve is to increase interest rates to quell economic activity. They say the economy is too hot. It's too much of a hot job market. There are so many jobs that workers are now able to negotiate for higher wages. I disagree with that framing entirely, but they've made it their goal to raise interest rates so that people can't start businesses as easily. Existing small businesses can't invest in them. We quell some of that economic activity so that there are less jobs. And we address this kind of supply-driven inflation, which is not the cause of current inflation, but nevertheless, their explicit policy is to quell economic activity on the supply side. So then if you increase demand and you free up a lot of capital among borrowers, that becomes a problem. This is what a lot of classical economists will tell you, or neoclassical economists rather. The only problem with that is we're already in a place now, and we have been for years, where the people who have student loans haven't been paying them. We're already in a place where any suspected demand that would be heightened has been. And so we're in a place where I think we can forgive student loans. We can free up that capital. We haven't seen aggregate demand get to a place where demand is surpassing supply. But if we have these terrible policies for the economy coming out of the Federal Reserve of continuous interest rate hikes trying to quell economic activity, we could get to that place. And so they really need to think critically about how they would roll out student loan forgiveness and really work with the Federal Reserve so that we do have a situation where supply matches demand there.
Yeah, well said, Jessica. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.